Hi, Cottage Grove. Did you get my email? I can't hear you. You have to actually press the... Huh? Yes. Yeah, you just turned it off again, but okay. Did you get my email? You had a question? No? Okay. It still isn't, you have to turn the mic on for me to hear you.
I've been at home, I have a son with pneumonia.
I see.
So I missed that, but my reading's up to date, so.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I'm here.
Glad to see you. Any questions from reading? World events? General question. I always put that out. Should I give up? No. All right. No. All right. So the field stopped being addictive substances like ingestive addictions. It stopped doing that about 30 years ago as our culture started becoming more complicated. So the idea is that it just starts with substances. And sometimes people or addicts will do things that don't make logical sense, but are basically an attempt to gain relief. So this is basically going with the idea that an addiction is a goal-oriented behavior. So let's see, if I were going to draw this out. Someone asked about, am I doing the biopsychosocial right? So if you took the vignettes, so I did vignettes of 5 different clients that could be boiled down for the purposes of presentation to a paragraph. So if you started with that paragraph and expanded it to 4 to 5 pages, that's it. That's all you need to do. But the thing is, starting with that paragraph and just turning in that paragraph alone, that would be problematic. The reason being is you could say, to use one example, let's say that Angela is a 35-year-old unemployed single mom, domestic violence, alcohol, and other drugs, etc., etc., etc. Now, each one of those, so unemployed, single mom, which one do you single out? Well, you don't single out any one of those could be driving the behavior, plus the domestic violence. So yeah, you can describe what the basic problem is in a paragraph, but the devil is in the details. And that's where the 4 or 5 pages comes in, because you got to actually go into where are you going to start with this person, because you got to know what's driving the behavior and also what she's been doing to compensate. And has she been doing, is she on unemployment? She receiving TAMF? Where is the biological dad? Are there stepdads? She got underground economy involvement, sex industry involved. You've got to basically flesh it out. Where could people go with these set of behaviors and these set of problems? Because the substance abuse problem could be generated by the other things that are going on if she weren't given coping skills to deal with it. Because where do you learn coping skills? Theoretically, you could learn them from your family, whatever that is. But how do you expect to cope with an impossible situation unless you've seen that behavior modeled? What school do you go to? I just had a phone call from somebody that's, I'm an executive producer of a movie about, did you know these kids are You know, they're taking other people's pharmaceuticals and they're partying with them. And getting, yeah, I did know that. Like, that's 15 plus years old. So part of the issue that you want to deal with is, okay, don't just look at the phenomenon between 12 and 18. Look at where it started beforehand. Look how some of the structures in society are supporting that. And those kids might not be able to get into treatment. And so if you're looking for money from me or money from a treatment agency, they're paid to do something else and not be able to donate money for film projects. State takes a very dim view of that. You're supposed to be doing treatment, right? But if you look at addiction as being a goal-oriented behavior, and your biopsychosocial is basically a description of the bigger picture that gives you an idea of where do you start first. Now, we focus on substance abuse if that's going on, but once they stop using, and if you can keep them stop using, because that often is a lot of our effort, once you keep them not using, then the other things start to boil up, the emotional issues. So, for example, if they were self-medicating for anger or depression or taking a drug that suppressed all those things, as part of the withdrawal process psychologically and emotionally. So what I mean by that is you might be off of opiates in 3 to 5 days in terms of detox, but the emotional detox might take months. And you might have feelings of rage or anger boil up that, well, how do you handle that without using? How would you deal with that? So when people do things that don't make logical sense but are an attempt to gain relief from their emotions, it's kind of like it's an irrational attempt to relieve what? So, for example, knew someone, this is bordering, you're not doing this to get high, so you crush Endorphin. Endorphin is essentially aspirin, salicylic acid. So aspirin was designed to go oral. Acid environment, acid drug, right? So crushing Endorphin and then snorting it is not going to get you high. Aspirin, don't try this at home. Aspirin doesn't get you high except when you take large doses of it with Coca-Cola, and yeah, it gets you high, but it also eats your stomach lining. People do weird stuff to get high, and some of it borders on what we didn't learn in substance abuse back in the day, but now we call it SI or self-injury, right? So snorting aspirin results in nosebleeds. And that was part of the addictive syndrome with this particular person. There's a form of cutting or self-injury. So SI is another piece that we're dealing with as an addictive behavior. So cutting, and what I mean by addictive tats is that some people, tattooing is painful. In cultures of tradition, it's done to mark your body after you've gone through some life-transforming rites of passage that's culturally defined, and it's a sign, like a wedding ring or something like that, that you've gone through that and you've basically gone through the appropriate adulthood ritual, right? Here, we do it for all kinds of reasons, and the reason I say addictive tats is that some people get into a syndrome of inflicting pain or having pain inflicted on them, and part of their addictive process is inflicting that pain. So new tats, piercings on their own, piercing, burning, cutting, all those. So self-injury, self-harm test. 1, do you deliberately cause physical harm to yourself to the extent of causing tissue damage, breaking the skin, bruising, leaving marks that last for more than an hour? Do you cause harm to yourself as a way of dealing with unpleasant or overwhelming emotions, thoughts, or situations, including dissociation? So if you understand what dissociation is, if this is a new word, part of the survival mechanism of the brain when you're going through extreme trauma is to distance yourself from it. This is happening to somebody else. This isn't happening to me while you're in the experience. Because partially psychologically, it's difficult to be that person who is going through whatever the experience is. So you dissociate from it. There are some drugs that actually do this for you. Phencyclidine comes to mind, PCP, ketamine specifically does that. There are some other drugs like that, but ketamine and phencyclidine PCP are both dissociative anesthetics. That is, they disassociate you from the pain and the scene. So the anesthetic stops the pain, and there's a psychedelic component as a side effect, as it were, that distances you from the scene, so it makes you think that it's happening to someone else. The original use of phencyclidine, PCP, was in pregnant women. They actually gave it to pregnant women because this is when we thought that pregnancy was a disease, so obviously you can figure out who would think that. Male doctors, right? So you give the woman a drug in labor that cuts the pain. Labor is painful, cuts the pain, and it distances her from what's going on with her body. Now, as a side effect, right? So remember, there are no side effects. There are only drug effects. There's the effects that you can market and the effects that you can't market so well. So as a side effect of PCP, not only did it cause hallucinations, but in some people it caused retrograde amnesia, which meant that when the woman comes off of it, what is this thing? Doesn't remember the pregnancy. That's not very good for bonding with newborn and mom, right? So they stopped using it in humans and started using it as a large animal tranquilizer, because I guess we don't care what the consciousness of horses and lions and elephants is, right? So it became a street drug. And so it probably has resurfaced, though, because we haven't done, the drug testing in spice, because when spice is, if this vegetable-like substance that we're supposed to be burning this for incense, or it tastes like blueberries or whatever, and you smoke it and you have these extreme hallucinations and disassociation, I'm more of a mind to go with, this is just somebody redoing PCP because the current generation doesn't know about PCP from 20 or 30 years ago, rather than it being a new substance. But it could be a new substance. If you're in the field long enough, you see old trends coming back as if they never existed. So part of what happens with disassociation actually happens without drugs, and usually is in response to stress. So if your self-harm is not compulsive, do you often think of it self-injury even when you're relatively calm and not doing it at the moment? So that's part of where the addictive process with this comes in. And if yes to 1 and 2, you are a self-injurer. If yes to 3, you are most likely a repetitive self-injurer. So basically we're assessing a continuum. That can be, part of your biopsychosocial if you see that. Now, I'm not saying that all people piercing or tatting part of an addictive process, but it has happened often enough, and people have come to me here to include it.
What chemicals released in the brain when pain receptors are?
You anticipated it. Okay? All injury causes an endorphin reaction, okay, which is endorphin literally means morphine within. This is the neurotransmitter that opiates are similar to. And basically what endorphin does is it doesn't actually stop the pain, it just makes you so you don't care. You can manage it. So women in labor produce a lot of endorphin. So it does cut the pain somewhat, and it's also sort of a high. Running junkies, okay? For the first 5 minutes you're running on adrenaline. and it hurts. You get stitches, etc., etc., no matter how much you train, and then all of a sudden, you feel great. That's the endorphins kicking in. Okay, it's a cloudy day, you walk out, all of a sudden it's sunshine. That's endorphin kicking in. Right? So endorphin reactions, if you're addicted, well, I won't call myself a habanero addict. I just like it. So the rush from hot food, there is no taste bud for hot. What hot is a chemical burn that produces endorphins in response to the pain that you get from eating hot, spicy hot food. All right? So injury causes an endorphin reaction, but it doesn't resolve the root cause or the issue of which the behavior is the symptom. So why do people regularly overdose with alcohol and consider that normal behavior? Part of that is induced ignorance. Part of that is basically this is the only coping tool that I had modeled. Right? It's not considered a problem until they kill someone or themselves, and usually it's not themselves. But I mean, that's one of the things in terms of, I'm training you to recognize we need to prevent this behavior before it gets to that stage. So when I talk about abuse inflicted by others upon targets, who I'm talking about targets is, I prefer the term targets to victims. So you can, if this is from the military point of view, you can harden a target, that is, make it more difficult to reach or to damage, and it's easier than making a victim less available to abuse. Make the victim potential target stronger. So, people in relationships with addicts, they can experience or witness intimate partner violence. So domestic violence is when you live together in the same domicile and the violence happens within your home. But you don't necessarily have to, to experience that DV. So intimate partners don't have to live together, and the relationship doesn't have to be sexual, just emotional. So in terms of looking at that particular issue when you're writing, part of your biopsychosocial, and so I want to go into looking at, okay, this is part of an addictive cycle. Well, that's how we have begun to conceive of it, and we didn't necessarily conceive of it 30 years ago. But because intimate partner violence often occurs in the presence of chemicals, it's part of our field. We need to look at it. So without physical violence, a person can become addicted to being in a coercive power and control relationship, which becomes like a drug in terms of brain reward. Okay, this is from the point of view of the abuser. They can actually be strung out on basically going on a power trip with someone. Okay, this is male or female. So not necessarily thinking of this as just heteronormative. All right? So adults can inflict this violence. The adult target experiences pain, loss, and fear along with the addict, and that's caused by the addict. Any children in the environment also experience ongoing stress in terms of what their nervous system become adapted to, which might not be a big a deal if the nervous systems evolved from survivors of genocide or slavery, which is not to say that it's experienced any less boldly, but, i.e. they could be used to it, centuries of abuse, that could be normal, but it's not normal within our particular context. This is why, as if you're training to be mandatory reporters, it is a felony to allow a child to witness domestic violence. So somebody has to report it. Better if you're the mom being abused and you're being abused in front of your children, better you drop the dime on the abuser than somebody else. Because if you allow your kid to witness all that, they begin to look funny at you. Just saying. All right. So notice that the centuries of abuse doesn't necessarily make it right. I began my career looking at people who are labeled emotionally disturbed, and essentially what they were witnessing, they were children of alcoholics witnessing domestic violence, self-medicating with marijuana in the 3rd grade in LA. But they were given the label severely emotionally disturbed and not even looking at the fact they were children of alcoholics, essentially witnessing abuse and having PTSD behind that. None of these were concepts in 1971. All they had was severely emotionally disturbed. I wouldn't be surprised if certain ADHD kids were like that too. And this is just another label that we're putting on to cover up another problem. Medicating kids with amphetamines after they've witnessed abuse is not a cure for the abuse, not a coping skill. And so that's why we have to kind of do good work with our whatever resembles a biopsychosocial within our particular field. And I'll get off that soapbox and move on. So PTSD, PSSD, we talked about, post-slavery stress disorder, multi-generational trauma, can all often accompany or be predictive of domestic violence or self-injury. So this is a power and control wheel generated by folks who deal on an ongoing basis with intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence. So it's a coercive control model. And basically, within the wheel, there are ongoing coercive tactics. That is, people who are forcing other people to do things against their will or stay against their will. So if we started in the 1 o'clock position, intimidation and fear, emotional abuse. So at the center, you have issues of power and control. And in this case, power means power over instead of power with. So intimidation and fear, emotional abuse, isolation, using the kids as hostages, blaming, denying, minimizing, micromanaging somebody's life, economic abuse, withholding money, and using force and threats. Basically, part of the coercive tactics would be removal of liberty, basically isolating them from friends, not letting them drive, not letting them get a driver's license, not letting them answer the phone. There's all kinds of different strategies within that, using intimidation, isolation, and fear. And it starts small and builds up. So there's an ongoing cumulative routine, a script, a strategy that abusers use. And this can often be very difficult to break because you can see until a person, if I were going to use a descriptor that somebody's a doormat, well, doormat's a very powerful position in the sense that if you're taking a lot of abuse and it isn't destroying you, you could get up. But building the psychological and emotional strength to get up is part of the problem. Believing in yourself enough to do that, to leave. Because it becomes an addictive process just as much. Because if this becomes kind of like a substitute for healthy loving, and you assume that if the abusive relationship and abusive relationships are the only role modeling that you've seen of love, then that's what becomes normal to you. So when we talk about the family, and when we hear a lot of talk about the traditional family, and so the question becomes, certainly in communities of color, what tradition and whose tradition are we talking about? The traditional family. So when you hear popular culture talking about the traditional family, what is that? What does that look like?
Like American Dream those days.
American Dream? Like, okay, so describe that.
White picket fence, 2 kids, a dad.
2.3 kids.
2.3. And then.
Goldfish and a dog and a cat.
A girl and a boy.
Okay. All right. What else?
Stay-at-home mom.
Stay-at-home mom.
Working dad.
Working dad.
Family dinner
Family dinner every
every night.
evening. Say grace. All that kind of stuff. Go to church on Sunday. Right? So, the television family of the 50s. The traditional family. Heterosexual. Oh, everybody's heterosexual, right? They're married, right out of high school sweethearts or whatever, right? So we call that, what's the word for that? Traditional family, also nuclear. The nuclear family. That is a heterosexual pair bond, male and female. I'm a psych major, not an art major. Right? 2.3 kids. Etc. Right? Close enough? All right. So, here's the rub, though. How old is the human genome? Hmm? No, the human genome itself. Good catch, though. Humans have been around for about 250,000 years. How long has the nuclear family been in existence? A little before then, but not much more than that. What were people doing? Who's a native Oregonian? I'm not a native Oregonian, but I was told even if I had been here, I wouldn't be a native Oregonian. That real native Oregonians, their families came here on the wagon train. Right? You heard that before? Okay. So when that was happening, those were nuclear families and extended families doing that. All right? So here's what anthropologists basically say about the family structure. The traditional family structure was extended. The nuclear family only happened in times of war or disaster because it was the smallest unit that could survive and move and be mobile. Traditionally, people lived in tribal groups, so mom and dad, their mom and dad, family farms, etc., 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 and villages. So the traditional family basically only happened with the Industrial Revolution, where you had dad going off to work in the factory and mom staying at home, with the kids in an extended family situation. Right? So that tradition isn't all that old. Traditional family has only been a tradition since the late 19th century with the Industrial Revolution in this country, and then not with everyone. Okay? So before that, the family was extended or tribal for everyone. Mom, dad, kids, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, play cousins, etc. That's the family that I grew up with. An African American extended family. Yeah, mom and dad and my brothers and sisters lived in a house, but we also lived in a neighborhood too. So the family used to transmit the values of the culture, who you were, right or wrong, do's or don'ts, wills or won'ts. Family used to transmit that before television and the internet. Television slightly reflected certain values. That's why we have the ideas of the traditional family from Leave It to Beaver and all those other folks. But, you know, what if you weren't white? What if you were Native? What if you were Latino? You didn't live like that. You lived, yeah. It's your grandmother that raised you. It's your grandfather that raised you. And this wasn't necessarily dysfunctional. It was basically flexible. My grandpa became dad when dad went to medical school. That wasn't a trauma, but I spent a lot of time with my cousins, both sides. So, nuclear family, bio parents and kids only existed, according to Margaret Mead, in times of war or trauma as the smallest survivable traveling unit. So that traditional family, stay-at-home moms, right? Working dads outside the home. Kids go to school after learning potty training, table manners, social manners, their ABCs, timetables, and then drug-taking behavior. And what I mean by drug-taking behavior, if we're talking this time, cigarettes and alcohol. Because the age-controlled drugs, that is tobacco and alcohol, were socially accepted. Yeah, we know you're not supposed to drink until you're 21 or smoke until you're 18, but how many people did that? Really? If you weren't Mormon. All right, so stay-at-home moms producing kids who are, and this is one of the challenges that we have not only here at Lane, but in higher ed in particular. What happens if you aren't ready to learn? What happens if you take a math class and you don't get fractions? Or you didn't have your timetables? How can you take a foreign language like Spanish and conjugate verbs if you don't know what a verb is in English? Right? The home was supposed to give you all that stuff and produce ready-to-learn kids. And maybe theoretically it did, and I know it did in my case at my home, but parents stayed together forever, demonstrated appropriate drug-taking behavior, conflict resolution styles, courting, the birds and the bees, the sex talk, home economics, saving and spending, work ethic, all that stuff. The family is basically supposed to impart those values. But here's the challenge. What happens when the family breaks up and those things aren't imparted? Who is supposed to impart those things? Precisely. Who? Ain't happening. The school system, right, which wasn't designed to do that. So, that's one of the things we find, certainly, the drug counselors teaching classes because, wait, this stuff isn't visible. Got to know what's missing before you can fill it in, right? Because what happens is we get to fill it in within the field. Because people's drug-taking behavior is often in compensation for whatever broke their family up, if it were together to begin with. Okay, so what takes its place? Basically the school systems, which keep getting, we won't go into funding crisis of education, but again, where do you get these quote-unquote traditional family values if you don't come from a traditional family? All right, so then, if not school, then media, your using buddies, your friends, your group, your Facebook friends, your friends with benefits, an extended peer group, whatever their values are. So coping skills. So what coping skills are, and that's one of the things that we're trying to teach once we get people detox and then get their brains in a stage that they can learn. So concepts, tools, identifiers, strategies, what I call memes. So who gives them? How do you use them? How do you test them? So for example, when they say, if you get mad and they say, take a breath, take a deep breath. Well, actually, what you should do is take 10 deep breaths in a particular pattern. And I suggest 5-second inhale, 10-second exhale. 10 of those. Okay, that means you're taking 4 breaths in a minute from your usual LA freeway 20 breaths in a minute to 4. That puts the brain in a brainwave state, and it begins to induce the release of certain neurotransmitters that are calming. If you do that breath pattern for 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes, puts you in a calm state. Better than just doing 1 breath. Okay, so that's a strategy meme by itself. All right, so who gives them, how do you use them, how do you test them? So often what happens in treatment is theoretically we're the ones that are giving the stuff that the family did not. Backfilling, as it were. Okay, and then how do you refine them? So that breath tip I gave you was basically a refinement of a basic old coping skill about take a deep breath before saying anything. Read your email before sending it. Edit it. Don't just fire off a text you may regret.